The question I'm dealing with is, do intentions play a role in the explanation of language change? Now, if they play a role in language change, the questions are, how do they do it? At which linguistic level it is salutary to invoke them? And three, and how do they contribute to the explanation of language change? But at the beginning, it is crucial for discussion to make a distinction between doing A intentionally versus having an intention to do A. An example, he intentionally, the person, ran to the station, thus causing a heart attack, but he did not intentionally cause the heart attack. Okay. You're familiar with this. Now, Michael Bradley says intentions are distinctive states of mind, here meaning intentions as having intentions to do A. Also, Michael Devitt, intentions like beliefs and desires are thoughts, propositional attitudes. I have to move down.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's taking a little bit of. Where am I now? Okay.
Your friends.
Okay. Right. Okay. So I follow the application of this distinction A and B in linguistics writing, in linguists writing about language and language change. So we ask, is having an intention in the sense of number two plays explanatory role in language change? I proceed as follows. In section 2, I present some old and some more recent opinions on language change. In section 3, I set the scene restricting myself to the discussion of two models of language. Language as autonomous system versus language as the so-called rational agent system. The question is, does language change happen internally as claimed in the approach to language as an autonomous system, or do speakers have an important role in language change as claimed in the rational agent system? In section 4, I further discuss the adoption of the theory of biological evolution as applied to language change, and I briefly look at some criticism of such approach. Now, the role of intentions stay the central issue. In section 5, I review what has been said about intentions in language change. Section 4 shows that the discussion on speakers' intentions by linguists is insufficient and even contradictory. I'm having trouble with this.
You can click down on this arrow.
Okay, maybe now I can do it with the. Okay, in section 7, okay, I can do it now with the arrows. I propose that the view that in using language IA is speaking and in changing it we need to help ourselves with intentions is implausible. If this is true, then my first suggestion is that intentions have a role to play at higher linguistic levels, and especially in speakers' communicative strategies. In sections 9, I argue for levels of explanation in language change. I also briefly introduce the emergentist approach in linguistics and try to relate it to the emergentist approach in the explanation of biological evolution as suggested by Dennis. It's very tentative, short. I conclude by relating some of the highlights of the paper of Cathy Wilkes' comments on language and intentions in language. All right, causes of linguistic change is just to show whatever in the past. Linguists have always been concerned with the question of why languages change. However, most of the explanations provided in the past have been rather fanciful. So what we find in Jesperson, he mentions some of them. For example, like changes due to the anatomical structure or articulating organs. Then harsher consonants found in the languages of Caucasians as contrasted with the pleasanter sounds in the region more favored by nature. 3, the well-known consonant shift believed to be characteristic of Germans because of their progressive tendency and desire of liberty. They do sound good. than the breeding efforts in mountain environments. Less outlandish reasons like imperfect language transmission, ease of articulation, laziness theory, etc. So Jean Aitchison says, when we have eliminated the lunatic fringe theories, we are still left with an enormous number of possible causes to take into consideration. Focusing on current literature, let us look at two models of language where we find the reasons given for the explanation of language change. In one of these models, the language is seen as an autonomous system where speakers do not play any role in changing the language. In the other model, the so-called rational agent model of language, speakers play a role in language change. In this model, speakers' intention in the second one become important. So a little bit about language as an autonomous system. Before the 60s, with the birth of social linguistics, there was little or no systematic study of the possible roles of speakers in social interaction as initiators or carriers of change. The language Turner position was the default position in the explanation of language change, with a relative neglect also of conduct phenomena. American historical linguist Roger Laws is a good representative of the model of language approach as an autonomous system. His ideas are presented in 80 and in his book later in 1997. Laws does not believe that language change is the result of human action, except in a very distant, secondary, and probably uninteresting way. Lass is supportive of Sappier's idea of language change as a drift, which is unconscious or rather unknown to the normal speaker. Lass sees language as a population of variants moving through time and subject to selection. His argument, he says, point the way towards a reasonable, non-individual and non-social definition of what we mean by a language, where speakers' role in language change are totally excluded. He says, endogenous change is part of the nature of the beast. This is why I put beast in the title. Now, the rational agent model of language is well represented by James Miller, especially because he goes into open discussion with Roger Lass. For the autonomous view of language and language change, James Miller says, a bit ironically, good heavens, says the language, I am becoming ambiguous. I better use my preposition to make myself clear. On the other hand, Lass complains about the rational agent model because it attempts to get inside something that, because of its immense historical extension, may not have an insight at all. Lass' attempt is, he says, to get away from pseudo-causal mysticism into something more like fresh air. Milroy argues, as social linguists do, that speakers, listeners play a vital role in language change, and that, in addition, language changes in response to changes to external social conditions. If the model of language is speaker-based, then the role of speakers' actions and intentions in the explanation of language change become rather central. Are speakers doing something intentionally to language? Do they deliberately set out to bring about changes in language? Now, general agreement is that speakers do not change their language with the aim of changing it. If this is true, then what are speakers doing? What kind of intentions should we or could we ascribe to them? Now, before proceeding, let us look into the most recent approach to language change model on evolutionary theory. I'm just presenting, I'm not going to go into discussion whether it's right or wrong, but ideas from biological evolution to language, and for that matter to cultural evolution, are not new. The close relationship between biological evolution and language was noted by Darwin himself in an oft-quoted passage from The Descent of Man. The formation of different languages and of different species, and the proofs that both have been developed through a gradual process are curiously parallel. During the last few decades, it has been fashionable in linguistics and in some other human sciences to look to the theory of evolution for a new explanatory framework. Now, a number of books appeared: Keller, Saliloko, Croft, which I'm going to discuss a bit, Gibbon, Ritt, and so on. I will discuss in some details William Croft's book, Explaining Language Change in Evolutionary Approach. There are two reasons for this choice. Since our topic are intentions in language change, Croft discusses them more than others do, I think. The other reason is that his approach has been rather harshly criticized, especially by John Anderson. I will say a little bit about the criticism, not much. Croft's approach assumes a usage-based evolutionary model, i.e., language change occurs in language use. And also variation in language is the crucial factor in language change. Croft tries to show the mechanism and processes that are postulated by evolutionary theory in biology can be applied to language change. Now, evolution is a two-step process. There is ordered replication, that is innovation, and then selection. The causal mechanism of evolution in language change is also a two-step process. This is how Croft presents it, actually. There is innovation, and then there is propagation. Innovation, the outcome is different in structure from the original. Here's just one example. Bad, for example, may be pronounced with a slightly higher vowel than one heard before. Selection is a process of perpetuation of relevant innovation in a community of speakers. So speaker innovates, and then the innovation has been taken by the community. It spreads. In biology, the novelty emerges from blind recombination and mutation of DNA. The question then appears to be, is the innovation in language also blind, random, or is it not? Now, opinions differ. Under one view, variation in language arises randomly, like variation in biology, but this is what is claimed. But it is only the process of selection which brings order into language change. Of course, on the other view, variation arises non-randomly. The question is important since the interpretation of the role of intentions hangs on it. If errors in linguistic replication are random, as are errors in DNA replications, then it has consequences for the role of speakers' intentions in the innovation of a new language variants. Now, very short criticism from Anderson's side believes that change, of course, this biological approach to language change has been criticized in a number of ways, but Anderson believes that change in language is produced by its speakers as part of the exercise of their free will. Speakers, as free agents with their human minds, are the agents of change. This is what Anderson believes. And the quote, the creative aspects of practices and traditions of speaking that matters. So they are not an accidental, but an essential characteristic of language. These speakers are free agents and creative innovators, and they are the locus of language innovations. That intentional actions are central and crucial for the explanation of language change. Anderson concludes then that there is no chance of explaining language change by the mechanism of evolutionary theory, because humans are free agents and so on. And this is not how the evolution works. In the evolutionary model of language change, which is supposedly mechanical and blind, one would expect that the role of speakers is minimized or non-existent. But this is not the case, as we shall see. What has been said about speakers' intentions? So I'm reviewing a little bit. Whitney, for example, had the view that language change is governed by two different forces: conscious intentional action, individual variation, and unconscious consequences. Braille, this is in the past, thought that language changes are brought about unconsciously, but by an unconscious that has depth, so to speak. Okay, I will comment on this a little later. Anderson sees the speaker as a rational agent imposing values on content and expressions and doing something in the course of linguistic change. If this is so, one would expect that he would discuss intentions in great details. But Anderson is very wary of talking about intentions, and this is a quote. The fuzziness of the notion of intention speaks in favor of shifting our attention from the innovating speaker's inscrutable state of mind to the purpose or purposes served by given innovations. James Milroy says almost nothing about intentions. Most of it is, it does not follow from speaker-based position that speakers deliberately set out to bring about change in language. We do not see into their minds. They care not about the language. What do we find on speakers' intentions in the evolutionary model of language change? If the evolution is blind, then by analogy, language change is blind. It is the result of chance. It is random. One would expect that the stress on individual role in language change then would be minimized. But this is not so. On the contrary, the attempts are to show that the individual and his/her intentions are still very central to the explanation of change. So Rudy Keller, who is also works on the biological metaphor, for example, says, the speakers change their language only sounds inappropriate because the speakers do not change their language intentionally and systematically, but unconsciously. Keller sees language change as an unintended causal effect of intended human actions. Language change is a byproduct of speakers' intention to attain social communicative goals. He further says, there's no crucial influence on language without going through the freedom and intelligence of the speakers. The question mark is mine. In sum, there is always a conscious purpose involved, as in any communicative activity, whereas change is its usually unintended cumulative effect. Croft more concretely offers a chart of non-intentional and intentional mechanisms in language change. And here is the chart. Of course, I will explain it a little bit, but we cannot go into too many details. So he says there are intentional and non-intentional mechanisms. In normal replication, the non-intentional mechanisms are found what he calls entrenchment. And what is entrenchment? Is a psychological routinization of a behavior, such as the behavior recognizing a linguistic expression and producing it. Croft finds intentional mechanism in language convention, which is, he says, a common ground in a community. Let us look at the suggestions for innovation. So non-intentional mechanisms for innovation are speech errors, sound changes, hypercorrection, or hypocorrection. Croft says the speaker aims to produce a particular sound, but overshoots or undershoots the target. Now, intentional mechanisms of innovation are expressiveness, creativity, avoiding understanding, and economy. All right. What possible conclusion can we draw from the above views on the role of intentions in language change? One can obviously find the discussion sparse and insufficient. Looking at the indexes of many books on language change, we find very few entries, if at all, on intentions. Two, more importantly, a number of claims on the role of intentions are questionable and even contradictory. Here are some examples. Anderson who stresses free will and creativity of the speakers, downplays the talk of intentions. Keller talks about the power of free will and necessity as a cause of language change, which he claims should correspond to the interaction of factors like chance and necessity in the evolution of inanimate nature. Now, how does free will correspond to chance in the evolution is not clear. Frequently, people assume that chance allows for free will, while in fact it is difficult to say how random chance phenomena allow for free will. Thirdly, Secondly, and possibly most importantly, when linguists are using intentional, it is not clear if intentional is used as doing something intentionally or having intentions to do something. For example, in his hierarchical view of intention, Krop says, certainly normal replication adherence to convention is an intentional mechanism. Now, what does this mean? I would say yes, if by intentional mechanism Krop means intentional actions, number one. No, if it means that in conventional, normal, everyday language use, we as speakers help ourselves with intentions. Intentions, in my view, do not seem to have anything to do with language conventions. At least I want to argue for this in the next section. Intentions used in the explanation of language and language change seem to have a number of problems. First, unanswered questions. What is unconscious intentions, for example? Confusions, intentional actions versus intentions. Contradictions, free will versus blind selection. Now, a good methodological strategy is to seek non-intentional mechanisms first and only turn to intentional ones at some higher linguistic level. In such hierarchical structure, I follow Hala, a firm advocate of the elimination of intentions on the phonological level. For him, the source of variation is definitely the speaker who is unaware of the variation. He says, there exists in any speech community at any point in time a great deal of hidden variation in the pronunciation of words. By hidden, I mean the speakers exhibit variations which they and listeners usually do not recognize as variation. Speaker is totally unaware of any kind of change, so like in biological evolutionary theory, there is no mind directing the change, no choice is made to take one path over another. So Hala seems take some change in its initiation or innovation to be non-intentional. This is very likely true for the phonological level. Now, for so-called high linguistic levels, such as morphology and syntax and lexicon, my proposal is the speaker is not intentionally doing something, but he is nevertheless intentionally acting. In other words, my proposal is that in everyday language use, and with that language change, there is no need to invoke speakers having intentions at all. They do not play any explanatory role in the conventional language use. All right. However, in order to accept this proposal, we have to take for granted some background theoretical assumptions. One, we have to see linguistic competence not as a tacit knowledge that, but as a skill or ability, i.e. knowledge how. Why think that linguistic competence is just a skill or ability? Briefly, I quote David, because it has all the marks of one. It has limited plasticity, it is extraordinarily fast, the process of exercising it is unavailable to consciousness. Once established, it is automatic, with the result that it can be performed while attention is elsewhere. Furthermore, one has to accept that conventions play a significant role in language. Speakers in a community are participating in the same linguistic conventions. For David again, regularity is noticed by speakers and hearers, but very importantly, this noticing and catching on are likely not high-level cognitive processes. Likely they are implicit and procedural rather than explicit and declarative. If the above is accepted, then where do we find having intentions as playing an explanatory role in language use or language change? What kinds of language changes speakers are most likely to make by deliberate intentions? Here's a very sketchy list. Metaphorical uses of language, cases of new words created by high prestige individuals. Every generation of teenagers has its own slang vocabulary. Every specialized field has its own technical lexicon. There are words that are invented either entirely or partly, like Xerox email. An example is another nice example are the Icelanders who, this has been said, who talk to each other, discuss and decide on suitable Icelandic terms. Kropp states in the above chart that intentional mechanisms for innovation are expressiveness, creativity, not being misunderstood, and economy. And it seems at this level that somehow having intentions do play a role. In Anderson, we find the stress on the rationality of the agent, his free will, as evident in the creation of new words and poetic language. In the possible hierarchy from non-intentional to intentional action, expressiveness, creativity, free will, and rational choices are mechanisms found in deliberate intentional strategies and not in language as a conventional means of communication. So I hope it is clear what I'm claiming. Conventional using language use, there's no use to use intentions, okay? Only on this level. All right, so when one looks more carefully, one discovers that in trying to explain the innovation in language, linguists often change the subject, one might say, from the initial stress on individual intentions to the goals of communication, as if they give up this talk, their justification of intentions. This is covertly or more overtly present in linguists' writings. Milroy, for example, when asking who practices bricolage in language, switches from speakers' intentions to the discussion of speakers' communicative strategies. He says, the change that I'm about to discuss here is involved with communicative strategies of speakers. No change is ever independent of some form of speaker-based social motivation. Keller argues that the change is a byproduct of speakers' intentions to attain social communicative goals with their language use. Croft makes the distinction between speakers' innovation and selection, which he says is intentional. Language use is intentional behavior. What matters, however, is the goal of the intention. So here, intentional behavior, again, where is a confusion of acting intentionally or having intentions, which I pointed out before. Lass emphasizes the impossibility of the view that speakers take action in language change, but still says speakers are preeminently interested in communication and do not deliberately and cautiously aim at changing the language. Isaiah Cohen sees language change as rational action of human free will, and he says the real effective reason of a given change is that a community which might have chosen otherwise willed it to be thus. In sum, it seems to me the discussion of speakers' intention in language change is switched to the level of communicative interaction, and the stress is on the goals of communication. There is a general conviction, actually, that processes of language change are multi-causality phenomena, meaning that cognition and social structure interact and shape the path of language change. I mean, the issues are complicated, but let me just, I myself supported the idea that in weighing the role of mental and social, we can think there sure are different unreflective cognitive perceptual factors that contribute to innovation, but more importantly, we would not know about them if at all, if they are not completed by reflexive social evaluation. Right, this I'm trying a little bit with this communicative, which I didn't say very much, but it seems to me that the discussion is switched from intentions to communication. Now, emergentism is becoming more and more popular in linguistics, as evident in the recently published volume of the Handbook of Language Emergence in 2015 that has over 600 pages. So maybe a more theoretical, profitable way is to look at the hierarchical level of intentional talk within the emergentist approach. I looked at this as this is just a hint, actually. Emergentists characterize both the language of the community and that of the individual as being in the state of constant change and reorganization. The core idea, very broadly unifying this approach, is that level of linguistic structures emerge from patterns of usage across time. The most important stress is that language changes in a hierarchical manner and that the changes are determined by communicative functions. There is a lot of stress of interlocking hierarchical structure, where complexity arises from the recombination of small parts into larger structures. Now, I read Dennis's book, The Life of Music, which I love very much, Biology Before Genes, arguing for, if I read him right, an emergentist view of high-level properties. He says, this then is the general challenge of 21st century biology, how to account for the phenotype in terms of the system-level interaction of the proteins. Some biologists have called these properties emergent properties, but Noble prefers to call them systems-level properties. The high-level properties emerge from the lower ones, and linking levels is part of what systems biology is about. One of the important goals of integrative systems biology is to identify the levels at which the various functions exist and operate. Now, what is important in the emergentist framework is that explanation is possible only at the appropriate level. And in this case, the level at which it makes sense to talk about something. Now, in the case of intentions in language change, I suggested or gestured the levels are important too. My suggestion was that the levels where we can talk about intentions is much more on the creative use of language and communicative strategy than in ordinary everyday language use. In ordinary language use, I don't think we need any help of intentions. Noble also stresses the importance of social context. Obviously, any explanation of my pointing as an action would need to take the social context into account, the same in language change. All right.
No, it's okay.
We have gone some way from presenting language as an autonomous system, the speaker-based account of language, to the more recent evolutionary model of language. The discussion of speakers' intentions stayed the central issue. The most important suggestion put forward was that of the hierarchical order in the explanation of language change, from non-intentional to intentional actions, and finally to speakers' intentions. Speakers' intentions play a role at high levels related to creative language use and communicative strategies. I tentatively introduced the most recent attempt in emergentist linguistics, where it is assumed that the changes of language arise from the demands of communication. I tried to draw the parallel to the approach in the biological emergentist in the explanation of evolutionary change as suggested by Dennis Noble. High-level properties may emerge from the lower levels. Since we are celebrating Katie works, let me conclude with some of her views. Katie says, whether or not goal, I didn't find very much in her writing on language, but maybe I didn't look properly at many places. But these quotes are from the book of goals and no goals. Katie Wilk says, whether or not goal representations or intentions are essentially cited in the explanation of purposive behavior, I think it is obvious that they are. But it seems to me here that Katie is here saying that intentions are essentially cited in the explanation of purposive behavior. In other words, that intentionally doing something requires an intention to do an aim. I don't know whether I'm interpreting it right, but it seems to me that in that quote she says that we need intentions. I try to show that we actually do not. In the next quote, Katie says, he shot Lincoln, he pulled the trigger. I like this quote. He crooked his index finger. There comes a point low down in the hierarchy when we want to reject all talk of intentions. It is, to put it mildly, odd to say that the concert pianist intended to hit C sharp when playing a fast prelude. What is suggested in this passage is that intentions are not needed at the lowest point in the hierarchy, which is similar, I think, to my main proposal that language is simply a skill and there is no room for evoking speakers' intention at that level. Kathy Wilkes is mentioning implicit and explicit intention, maybe unconscious or conscious, I don't know. And she says, we thus find a sliding scale from the apparently clear cases of explicit or explicitly stated intentions to those that seem merely implicit. This comes close to the suggestion of a hierarchical order of levels of explanation, with explicit intention being introduced at high levels that have to do with communicative strategies. All right, now needless to say, the devil is in details, about which, sorry to say, I have not said much. Thanks a lot for bearing with me.